I'll be honest. I'm not sure how it has taken me so long to get around to talking about The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's works in general was my entry point to being more critical and academic about the nature of popular culture's importance in storytelling. It also holds a lot of personal significance to me, but maybe that's why it's taken so long to get around to. There's so much meaningful elements within this that sorting through it all can be really tough. While I could talk about all sorts of aspects of The Lord of the Rings today, I want to focus on one important point. Food. That may not be where you thought this would go for this channel's first foray into Middle-earth, but here we are. I think food in general is really fascinating. Cultures around the world have intricate food laws that delineate what should or should not be eaten based on aspects of morality. In many places, food regulations are what define one culture as being separate from another. And Middle-earth is no different. In fact, food is frequently used as a way to demonstrate differences between the varieties of peoples and nations throughout Middle-earth. The depictions of food, the relationships different peoples have with food, and discussions around food do a lot to give life to the story, and it's an important aspect of Tolkien's storytelling. His use of food, and particularly of different eating metaphors throughout the work, demonstrates relationships with power, and food becomes an important part of storytelling. Now, a quick note. Obviously, this is a video essay, which means that there is going to be an important visual part of what's going on. That being said, a lot of what I'm going to be drawing on is the direct source material, the books, rather than the movies. Though the movies did get a lot right and are still absolute beautiful works in their own right. In fact, probably a lot of what I will talk about in relation to food in the books is also in the movies, but thought it was worth mentioning. Anyway. Food is demonstrated as important from the very beginning. There were lots of elements of the chapter on concerning hobbits, which is at the beginning of the trilogy, that concerns food. The hobbits here are described as having mouths suited to laughing and eating and drinking, and that they ate roughly 6 meals a day. There's also a large portion dedicated to their various pipeweeds, most notably Old Toby. This means readers are brought to food's importance very early when it comes to hobbits. Hobbits are, quite frankly, obsessed with food. Hobbits, both in general around the Shire and for the 4 hobbits who then embark on the large adventures, have food as it being a very large part of their life and engagements. Bilbo interrupts the Council of Elrond to demand lunch. When healed after defeating the Chief Ringwraith, Merry wakes up and says he's hungry. Sam carries cooking equipment with him all the way to Mordor and even laments the loss of his pots and pans when he's there. Hobbits just love food. Their culture is filled with the simple joys and big feasts. The presence and details of their food is what distinguishes hobbits from other cultures. The food of elves, in contrast, is not described in great detail. Lembas is one of the most described aspects of elvish food and becomes a staple in the lives of the Fellowship, but it's not really described in detail or even what it's really made of. The rest of the elvish food is not given much attention, so much so that some scholars think elves were vegetarian, but this is mostly due to the lack of descriptions of meat, but lack of description isn't an example of what's technically there. The race of men also have food and some feasts, but their relationship with food seems vastly different. Feasts are reserved for special occasions and great occasions, while hobbits like feasts no matter the occasion. Food is much more of a necessity of life for the race of men rather than an aspect of life's enjoyment. The way that hobbits find food and eating so important is understood by other nations as well and used as a definitional point for them. Treebeard uses their relationship with food to describe the hobbits when he amends his song about the various groups of people in order to include hobbits. In his poem, he describes hobbits as hungry. Food is an important aspect of hobbit language. The best example of this actually comes from a linguistic joke of Tolkien's. The river that runs through the Shire is, in the Elven language, Berenduin, but when hobbits refer to it, the Elven word Berenduin becomes altered to Brandywine. Tolkien likes to make these little jokes and references about how language changes and moves over time, but it also reveals how important food and drink is to the hobbits, that they would change the name to something so related to consumption, particularly something that is deeply related to the Shire and their landscape. Another fun moment that's also a direct conversation about morality is the stew made by Sam with Gollum. Sam discusses the nature of cooking and making things delicious, and even comments about cooking some potatoes. But Gollum reacts violently against the idea. While this is kind of a silly scene, it also demonstrates fundamental differences between the moralities of Gollum and the hobbits. Gollum always sits somewhere in between the corrupted and the hobbits, who seem more jovial than corrupted, though obviously the corruption does happen to particularly Frodo. This is echoed in Gollum's choices of food. He is always hungry and discussing eating. Like hobbits, he has songs about food, though the words and depictions of Gollum eating are far more animalistic and gross feeling than that of hobbits. In the book, the words chosen to describe Gollum eating are words like devouring and gnawing. His choices of food are also equally disgusting to the likes of the hobbits, choices like raw fish, worms, and even trying to eat dead bodies. Gollum essentially is a demonstration of hobbits when they are corrupted. More corrupted nations, like the orcs for example, are also ones who eat with similar language, devouring, gnawing, chewing. Their choices are also more reflective, with discussions of meat and sometimes cannibalism. This meat, sometimes being described as flesh instead of meat, is definitely a move to paint these choices of food in a very specific light. But I can't let a full discussion of food and Lord of the Rings pass without discussing one of the most important, beautiful, and silly comments in the whole series. This is when Gandalf is talking to Bilbo about his life and how Bilbo is aging, or more accurately at this point, not aging. Bilbo says he feels like butter that has been scraped over too much bread.
I feel thin, sort of stretched, like butter scraped over too much bread.
There's so much going on in this quiet statement, so let's take it one at a time. First off, we have a reflection on how hobbits have a habit of speaking more simply. As Merry explains to Aragorn, "But it is the way of my people to use light words at such times, and say less than they mean. We fear to say too much. It robs us of the right words when a jest is out of place." I think this is fair for many of the discussions the hobbits have, but in the case of Bilbo's description, I think there's even more going on. In fact, I think this is the exact proper phrasing to use. This is because of our second point, which we've been waxing on about for a long time already: the importance of food. Food is so all-consuming, pun intended, for hobbits that it invades their language in names, but also in metaphor and other forms of folklore or interpersonal relationships. For Bilbo to reach for food as a way to explain things, it's an example of how pervasive food is in the culture of hobbits. But also, this statement from Bilbo is accompanied by other food metaphors that are not as related to hobbits. In the following chapter, Gandalf immediately uses eating metaphors to describe the ring and Sauron. Faramir continues the metaphor by describing the men given the 9 rings of power as being devoured by Sauron. Gollum says that if Sauron gets the ring, he will eat us all. Speaking of Gollum, he's both described and seen as being mortally hungry since the ring. Frodo sees a glimpse of a similar look in Bilbo when he reaches for the ring in Rivendell. Therefore, I think Bilbo's little comment about feeling like butter spread over too much bread is not only an apt description of what it feels like to age, but also a welcome entrance to metaphors and discussions around food, power, and corruption as it's depicted in The Lord of the Rings.